Oh my God, Dr. Thompson, you are not supposed to say that.
He would really do that?
And he'd be like, he just was like, and it just blew his mind. And after about 6 weeks of me, and sometimes he would freak out. So he would plug his ears sometimes. Like, oh, he'd be like that. Oh. But eventually, I sort of desensitized it to him, and his tics went away, his delusions went away, his fucked up behaviors went away, everything just went away.
We now bring you Enter the Freud.
Warning, this is for entertainment purposes only. It is no way medical advice. Listen at your own risk.
And I know most people think they know what boner shame is just because it sounds fairly self-explanatory. Because we all of us men, or those men with a penis, when we were in 8th grade and we were 13, we like suddenly started having tons of boners, like all the time in like biology class and in social studies. You just like would get a boner for no reason, and you're like, what the fuck? I wasn't, this is like, and then when you get up from class and have to go walk through the halls, you have to like carry your social studies book in front of your groin area so that everyone in the hall doesn't see that you have a boner, because we have boner shame. You don't want anyone ever to know that you have a boner. And it's kind of funny when you think about it in that sense, that like a boner is like an embarrassing, shameful biological event.
The average... okay, keep going.
Go ahead.
The average person with a penis gets a boner 11 times a day. This is just a fact, and then 5 more in the night. Okay.
Wow. So 16 times a day, and the average 13-year-old has a boner 11 times a day and gets intense shame 11 times a day about his boner.
Yeah.
But that's not the boner shame I'm talking about. I'm talking about a different, much deeper, more problematic boner shame, and that's the boner shame that is the unavoidable consequence of feminism.
Oh, okay. I see where this is going. Wait, I don't.
Because there was a cultural feminist revolution in the Western world, or maybe the whole world. I'll just talk about America. In America, you know, especially through the 60s and 70s. And not that, I'm not trying to blame the feminists. The whole feminist revolution was wonderful and necessary, needed to happen, but it swept up many other things in its insane momentum.
A lot of boners.
It wasn't just... Yeah, right. It swept up the boners, and it shamed the boners, because boners are bad, because boners rape women. Oh. And when you shame a rapey boner, you can't help but shame all boners, because there's good boners and bad boners, and the good boners thought that they were bad too.
Okay. All right. Well, dude, there's some pretty weird shit that is less funny about this, and some of it's really fucking hilarious, right? Like, as it drifts...
We should better start off with the funny stuff before we get into the fucking harrowing stuff.
Okay. The best... the ones that I thought were very funny coming out of Berkeley were like manspreading, right?
Manspreading.
Manspreading, which is the act of sitting with your legs like that while usually in public transport. So it occupies. Also considering raping the space is another term for that.
And manspreading is raping the space?
It's raping the space because it infringes on other people's use of that space. And you can't use the space that is being occupied because that's being raped. Okay?
Yeah, you can see how from a feminist perspective that manspreading or raping the space is a good symbolism of how men have just like inconsiderate of others, taken over the world with their cock.
Yes, with boners. with these 11 times a day phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is Anthony Weiner's contribution to this otherwise. I don't understand why it is that dudes send out dick pics to encourage some of these ideas. What goes on? What goes on with this like when you are shameful about things, sometimes you do overt, like extra act. You do things over the top to try to compensate for your otherwise shameful feelings.
Yeah.
But then so some of these terms go on to like, the term isn't raping with your eyes, but it's like, eye raping? Is that what it's called? Where if you stare at somebody...
He raped me with his eyes. I think that's the term.
I think that the term is actually eye raping. Like,
or gaze raping.
The male gaze is different, okay?
Okay.
We'll have to talk about that too. But raping, like eye raping, is the idea that you're staring at somebody. It could be a man or a woman doing it, but normally it's a man. Staring too long, often with your mouth open, suggesting... I'm serious. This is literally in the definition. Is like with that suggestive stare of you're thirsty, right? And thirsty is really different because there's something that is unwanted about it. It's like the idea of like being desperate for sex as opposed to just being horny and in the mood for sex. Right? And
okay,
what's the distinction?
Difference, it must be, if I really get down to the important distinction, is the if you're just in the mood for sex, then you can approach sex maturely. If you're desperate for sex, you might lose sense that there's another human there, and you might just start humping a thing, not knowing that that thing has its own psychology.
Dude, that is so... Okay, well, there is a distinction, and to talk about this and trying to be, like, level-headed and serious it's going to be impossible for me, but...
we'll get... Dude, we're going to get all serious and angry and yelling at the cameras, so it's good we're keeping it light here for a little while, because eventually we're going to descend into the angry man that's pissed that we have boner shame.
Yeah, well, okay, on to this idea of feminism and its potential contribution, because this is a very, very widely held idea of where men's shame about sexuality comes from. Is this kind of a backlash to this movement that kind of really picked up in the 2000s. And so then we go to, what was that term you said? It was the male gaze, right? Perpetrated by media and film. And in this way, it shows the way that the camera stops and fixates on women's bodies, or it shoots over a man's shoulder to show that this is the view of a man. And in these views that are being questioned, the views in question are ones that show the man in a position of authority and the woman over-sexualized. That is the male gaze in definition. Yes. Right? And so so it's true. It's totally true. Like, a lot of film was done in this way, and so then all those who view it, little kids, men, women, see this kind of a portrayal of things, and it would obviously shape some of what we do. And like, is that wrong? Should we change it? I don't fucking know.
Yeah, I think that it gets complex and confusing, but I think a way to make it simple and make sense of it is this idea. It's almost like a philosophical, existential idea. In Hinduism, it's like this theological assumption that in everything there's good and there's bad. And I think that's the trick, is see the male gaze, see, okay, there's good and there's bad in it, and then try to have the more complex awareness where you can discern the good parts and the bad parts, as opposed to what we more normally do, which is always just throw the baby out with the bathwater. We lump the good and the bad together, we don't discern them, and then we just label male gaze bad, or feminism bad, like the men's movement is now feminism bad, but everything is more complex than that. So, if a man looks at a woman and sees her beauty or sees her erotic attractiveness, there's that can be good or that can be bad. And if a feminist just labels that as bad, she's stupid and she's now going to do a bad thing and give some men boner shame. But if a man just says, no, me looking at a woman and thinking she's hot, that's always good. That's too simplistic too.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just more complex than that. And the feminist thing is more complex and the male gaze is more complex. And we just need to kind of sort out the good and the bad in each of these things.
But so, is it okay to transition to like, why is there such a prevalence of erectile dysfunction?
I think that what we should do, I don't think we should spend too much time on feminism or male gaze or whatever, because honestly, this idea of boner shame, everyone knows about it. Most men get it, but honestly, I don't think anyone has ever talked about it. So I think we got to be super clear about what boner shame is and really explain it, and then all the consequences of it.
Okay. So there are obviously medical reasons for erectile dysfunction. And that increases with age and with various diabetes and other health-related concerns and medications, right? And it has to do with like the hardening of the arteries that go into the penis, and then the veins going out drain out too fast, and so then you have a limp dick, right? Like this is the phenomenon of having erectile dysfunction medically. But depending on who listen to and which studies, it's like the majority of the people having it, and some people say that like every dude has erectile dysfunction at some point, right? Every dude, and then some would say, oh, it's 50% of it is psychological, and then, dude, there's apps to treat your psychological erectile dysfunction that you can get on this app and then do a type of cognitive behavioral therapy and like and a type of almost like focusing and mindfulness on your penis and somehow influence your erectile dysfunction. And okay, so the way that you know it's psychological versus medical is if you have erections at night. If you have erections at night, then it is not medical.
It's psychological.
And then during the day when it's time to perform and it won't happen, it's psychological. Right, like that. Well, okay, that's pretty simplified, but that's pretty good distinction.
Yeah, totally.
Right,
and so psychological can be from a lot of reasons, but one big one is what I'm calling boner shame, which is just basically that men have learned from culture that their sexual appetite is bad. And then a man has this push and a pull going on inside them because, of course, there's a natural biological sexual desire. And then there's this other thing inside of us that's like, no, that's misogynistic. You can't be objectifying a woman and looking at her ass and thinking it's hot and getting a boner. That's bad. You're not being a good feminist. You have a boner? You're not being a good feminist. There is that voice inside a lot of men's brain that's fucks with them, and it creates this like internal conflict around our sexuality.
That would be really hard to deal with if the onset of erections as a sexually mature person starting at puberty, right? 13, 14 years old, you first have these erections that are geared towards intercourse, right? Like they're designed for mature sexual contact, as opposed to whatever the hell happens as kids, and that's not in our conversation. And like, if this kind of a negative attitude comes up about the multiple times per day that you have this experience, well then of course you're going to end up with this like, what's the opposite of this? Like boner shame. What would be the opposite? Is like super confident.
Well, there would be a healthy opposite, which is just like comfort and confidence and acceptance of your sexuality, and then an ability to express it in a mature and healthy way. That would be a good opposite. The bad opposite would be just like boner domination, where you just feel like you need to and have a right to assert your boner on anything and everything.
You mean like it would be like what you said at some point was like, if you were the equivalent of the Liver King, but then because he looks like just a human boner, by the way. Like,
Yeah.
like if you were the boner king,
Yes.
somebody who would go around and just be like
bonering everybody. I'm just gonna boner her and boner her and boner her.
or just like publicly go around with an erection and just like have it displayed, have it nicely displayed as like, yeah, what about this? Huh? Like,
Right.
look at this. This is how I roll. Got a boner. It's a normal biological thing, right?
Yeah.
And like rather than hide it because it's a thing, like.
Right, just be proud of your boner.
I was in the basketball court just like a couple nights ago, and me and my son were there, and there was these teenagers on the other side of the court, right? And they're just like shooting and falling around. And at one point, this one kid's lying on the ground, and another kid yells out, "Oh, dude, you got a boner!" And the kid's lying there in sweatpants, and there's a little bump right where his wiener is, and he's like, "Oh, dude, I guess I got a boner." And then the kids are like, "Why is it only 3 inches, man?" And they all just proceed to laugh and laugh and laugh. And there's something odd about that where it's like, then the idea of boner then drifts into this weird conversation about penis size.
Yes. Yeah.
Like, and I don't know what to do about that conversation, because in all of my professional years, in all of my years of being on this planet, I don't know anyone who has talked to me about trying to increase their penis size. And
No. You see tons of ads about it, but you never hear people who actually do it.
I've never met anyone who has told me. I'm sure I've met people who have tried something, but no one has ever said to me, "Hey, guess what, man? I'm like taking these pills. I'm using this technique. I got this special pump." Like,
you think in our line of work where people share their secrets, their most guarded secrets, you'd think you and I would hear about it, but I've never heard about it.
You haven't actually heard about this also?
No, and I supervise like 15 therapists who each have 15 to 20 clients, so I have a view into tons of people, so it's not happening.
Why do you think that is? Like, I think the shame about boners and the potential boner size is so deep and so profound that no one would ever acknowledge that they have done something to try to deal with their... well, I have heard people talk about erectile dysfunction, but I have never heard of anyone say, "Oh yeah, I want bigger. I want to be the boner king," right?
Yeah, well, so it brings up this issue that we're kind of dancing around. Let me see if I can try to state it directly. Is that I think nearly every man, a super high percentage of men, in contrast to the public perception or the public persona, most men have a lot of insecurity around my boner, my penis size, and them like performing in bed, like getting an erection at the right time, not getting the erection too early, but then getting a really good erection when it's the right time, and then being able to keep the erection for the proper amount of time, not coming too early, but then also not being like taking too long to come. Like all of that, it's a minefield, and it's really difficult to perform it perfectly. And it's a really vulnerable, highly charged area. So I think the vast majority of men have all kinds of insecurities and worries and whatever around this whole thing.
Oh yeah.
But that's like in direct contradiction to the typical perception, and we, all of us men, really try to hide that, and we try to pretend that we're super confident and we perform super well, but it's totally a fucking facade to hide the reality is that all of us are quite fucking insecure and worried about boner sexual performance.
Dude, I'm just trying to like stay with the conversation and with my meta dialogue like coming along, and it's just like dumping in every time you say something. It's like I have another concept that falls in place. This is just like such a loud and neglected subject of
It's
like
so neglected, dude.
just because like okay, I'll point out another aspect of invisible shame about boners, all right? Like, dudes in general, when they have sex, just from the act of sex, because of the way anatomically men are designed, they will ejaculate, which is equated to an orgasm, right?
Yep.
Like, and then there's a direct comparison of, like, you know, it's 98% of dudes will ejaculate from having sex, and then the number's something like 66% of women will from the act of intercourse, right? And so that discrepancy in itself causes a unique problem of, well, I see two problems, right? One is that men ejaculating and having an orgasm is the same as women having an orgasm, and I don't know like what your thoughts about men ejaculating and then having an orgasm, which at some point is maybe very orgasmic or very mechanical, versus like some women's orgasms just appear to be significantly more profound than men's. And I don't know what to do with that comparison. I've heard people talk about it. My girlfriend is constantly talking about it, saying the opposite. Oh, really?
And it's made me come to the conclusion that nobody knows, because I don't know what it's like to be a woman having an orgasm, and she doesn't know what it's like to be a man. But she's convinced that men have much greater sexual pleasure, and I'm like, what makes you say that? I was more on board with you, where I felt like the women's orgasm was more powerful.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, right? It's just from like the experience of like, well, some experiences of ejaculation are just kind of like, oh, well, that happened. It's not, it's literally barely a blip on the radar of like, wow, that was such an amazing thing. Like,
whereas if a woman has an orgasm, it's almost always a pretty intense experience, and fairly often it's a fucking like world-shatteringly intense experience.
Sure, yes, sometimes, and also there are some women who have orgasms that are just like, oh, I'm gonna come, okay, like that's it, and you're like, whoa, that was really, like, what was that? That's it. Like, it's so this idea of like orgasms influencing the idea of like, if you, okay, so here's an unconscious strange concept that's crept into society, is like, if I have a bigger, longer dick, then I will produce larger sexual pleasure with my partner, right? Like that is a mythology that exists.
Yep.
And then, but you're not supposed to do anything to make it so that you have a bigger wiener, right? Like, as is indicated by our experience professionally and in our personal lives, is no one we know has ever fucking done anything like this, right?
Yeah. And
so then it's like, what is that? Like I know tons of women who do all kinds of Kegel exercises because they're concerned about their vagina and its vagina-ness, right? They do these kinds of exercises, like hold beads in there while they're in the shower, and like, what are they doing? What is that? I know women who do that, but I don't know a single man who like does some exercise of tweaking their wiener and like hanging weights on it or using a pump. Dude.
I think because men, we just try to all pretend that, yeah, my dick's the best, it's awesome, and we don't want to, like, open up the door to, like, maybe my dick needs improvement. I think that's, like, too terrifying to think.
But then there's all these people who get surgeries, like penile implants, which I wish I had looked into, like, who gets those? Like, what?
Penile implants? You mean just, like, guys with erectile dysfunction who can't get an erection?
Like, they will, they, like, cut the penis off way back there, and then they extend it out and reattach it.
Oh, that people do that?
Yeah. So they get, like, a longer wiener, and then they, like, insert things in there so it's fatter, or inject shit into it so it's like a blob or something, dude.
And it can still function?
Yes.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. But I don't know anything about, like, who does it. What are the stats? Like,
yeah.
Like, what is this? Don't you think it's odd that here we are, and when we try to talk about, well, okay, if there is such a thing as erectile dysfunction that happens from boner shame, and then there's ideas about how you should have, what kind of boner you should have, and then that's it. That's the end of the conversation. Then we have no idea what people are actually doing, who does it, what about the psychological implications of erectile dysfunction?
That's bringing my mind back to, like, I've seen a lot of patients, and all the therapists I supervise have seen a lot of patients there's a psychological profile that I think has gotten to be quite common, and that is a younger, they don't always have to be younger, but there's more, the younger you get, the more there are men who, they're usually politically, like, left wing, and they sort of see themselves as being good, kind, considerate men who are sensitive to ladies. Maybe they identify that they themselves are feminists, and they're trying to be good people and considerate of others. And they are at odds with their own boner, their own sexual appetite, and they can't, and there's this catch-22. So they try to be really nice and considerate, but they can't really get into this sort of, like, erotic, testosterone-y, like, hey, baby, you're looking hot, you want to, like, play. They can't get into that space because they think that's toxic masculinity. And as a result, women who are very often just naturally attracted to a more masculine assertiveness.
Yeah.
These men, they can't access that, so they can't, like, get the erotic chemistry going with women, because they often are just, like, friend zoned, or, like, the nice guy, or even when they do get in a relationship, the erotic charge just isn't there, and they come to therapy with a wide range of different complaints, but it's like you can just feel it's metaphorically and maybe literally, they're just, like, they have their testosterone turned off.
Yeah.
Because, like, they think that testosterone equals toxic masculinity, so they're just really nice and good, and they try to keep their penis nicely tucked away. Okay. And it leads to unhappiness in relationships and lack of sexual fulfillment.
Man, I think actually the latest research shows that it's estrogen that produces sexual aggression and sexual drive and impulse. Go fucking figure, right? Like, testosterone, estrogen, they're so closely linked together that we often talk about it as if it's testosterone that produces the drive, but it turns out it's certainly estrogen. But aside from that, your theory that, well, this particular theory that the cause of this left-leaning young dude who then has his wiener nicely tucked away is the result of his potential ideas of what a sexually assertive human being might look like, as opposed to the other explanation for this is the Tinder effect that predates Tinder, which is like 90% of the women are looking at only 10% of the men. And so then that's 90% of the men are fucking friend zoned, right? And so then is it actually the man's fucked up ideas about his own sexuality, his relationship to his penis, and the way that this whole thing works, his ability to assert and ask women out in a way that isn't creepy? Like, is that the result of his fucked up sexuality, whether it's influenced by today's trends of feminism, whatever, or is this just like purely driven by the fact that women have recently become exposed to so many dudes instead of just like they only have the guy who's in their class, who is on their bus, who works at the same place as them. No, now they just like search through like on Amazon. Wow, I got 1,000 different dudes to look at, and so I choose. I should be with the top one, which is it's always quite fascinating to, as a dude, get on a dating app and then put a decent profile up, and then have some women who are so beneath your level of attractiveness and whatever, however people are valued, right? And then have somebody who's like a 2 contact you and try to say some shit like, "Hey, handsome," and you're just like, are you out of your fucking mind, right? But this
you can't blame a girl for trying.
You can't blame a girl for trying, but that falls into this. It's just a statistic of 90% of the women. But just think of who are these women, right? 90% of the women are looking at 10% of the dudes, and so then.
And do you think that's just a natural biological thing, or you think that's a cultural conditioning thing that we've told every girl that she's a princess and can have her Prince Charming?
I have no idea. I literally have. I have no idea, and I don't even know how you would find the answer to that.
No.
What's your idea?
Well, you could do a cross-cultural thing. Is like you find some culture where, because I do think that, especially in America and in the West, girls are raised more and more by this post-feminist culture. They're taught that they're princesses. Well, this is how you would do it, is you'd do a survey of people, of women, and you'd ask them, did your mom treat you like you're the most wonderful girl in the world? And you'd have a bunch of questions to try to assess that, and then you'd have a bunch of questions and then you could just have a bunch of pictures of like, what kind of guy do you think you'll end up with? Then you could evaluate how hot they are. You could do that thing, and you do it with a lot of different women, and if it correlates that the chicks whose moms told them they were a princess have this unrealistic notion of how great a guy they can get, then that's the problem. Or if just all women have it, then it's just a biological thing.
That's that would totally work. I think your experimental design, it might need a few tweaks, but it's pretty damn good, right?
Yeah, it would certainly the results would be really interesting to see.
The results would be interesting. But then what?
And then to do a similar thing with men and compare, there would be differences, and it'd be interesting to see what the differences are.
What are you predicting about men? Like, what are you saying?
I just think that men would have a different thing. I'm not sure what it is. I think that the guys whose mom taught them that they were a prince, I think that honestly, an ugly dude, that fat, ugly loser dude, whose mom taught him that he was a prince, I don't think he thinks he would get to end up with a super hot chick.
Oh. Yeah.
Whereas a chick maybe would think she gets to end up with some wonderful gentleman.
Okay. Yeah, okay. That would be an awesome study to do. But then again, we're drifting slightly away from
Boner
the
shame.
subject at hand, which is like, with this category of guys who find themselves friend zoned and or their boners are not being worshipped, and or fuck worshipped, because that drifts into the further territory that will get condemned by society, and then, but like, just accepted, like men's fundamental need for sexuality and partnership and sexual gratification, which is like fucking important to all human beings, is struggling to be affirmed. There's some
totally, absolutely, and I think that the tables have really turned. Maybe women probably used to have that historically, and now it's the opposite. Now it's like women can be these sexual goddesses, you know, but men, men aren't out there like on Instagram or being like, I'm a sexual king. Like if a dude did that, everyone would think they're a fucking idiot. But every woman is like a sexual goddess. And we're like, yeah, sexual goddesses. But you imagine me being like, I'm going to be a sexual king. Like, I want everyone, I'm going to celebrate this on Instagram and I'm going to put a fake crown on it. I'm a sexual king. Like, give me a fucking break. No dude would ever do that in a million years.
Why? I think the thing that we did today is just fucking run through a shit ton of material. But we did it at like high pace. Like as if we're in a Spartan race. We're just like hitting the obstacles, blah, 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 blah. And I think maybe we should just slow down and be like, what the fuck are we talking about? What is this? What is a real implication? And is there any, like, what do you think the trend is going to do? Where is this going to go? Like, how far will it go until there are young men and women who just no longer have sex because only 10% of dudes are having sex, and then like the rest are in some kind of like I was gonna say discoordinated, but that's not right. I don't know what kind of a word I'm looking for to explain where the rest of all dudes would be, and for how long. Like when you're a tiny guy and you first get to sexual maturity, you have an unfulfilled sexual drive because you don't even know what it is at first.
Yep.
Like most people, somebody was telling me about their kid, and he had like a eternal nocturnal emission, like a wet dream early on, and because he didn't know what it was, he was like, oh shit, there's something wrong, I have a disease, I'm dying, shit came out of my dick. Right. And like similarly, just because you might attend a sex ed class and you're like, oh yeah, you get erections and then everyone laughs, ha ha ha, and then there's this thing called ejaculation and it's sperm and it comes from here and there, and then when that shit happens to you, you're like, what the fuck is this? What do we do with it? Right? And so that's a period of sexual development that every person with a penis goes through. And then at some point you figure out, oh, that's a thing that if I do it in this certain way, it creates a sexual relationship with another person. That's a type of contact. It's a type of bond. And then you, over time, this takes like fucking 10 years for most people to figure out like, okay, I have this thing. When I do it in this way, people are really happy about it. And then there's other early sexual contact where your partner is not happy with your penile performance. You either premature ejaculate and then you're like, oh, I'm sorry, shameful, or you have some kind of like strange issue where you don't really know what to do with your dick.
Yep.
Like you don't like, this is a super weird discussion about a phase that guys go through, and you either go through it for 1 month, 10 years, 20 fucking years of this unknown state, and then but this drifts into a territory of there's an inevitable learning curve of sexual experience that then comes with a lot of doubt, and this is argued to some degree that guys have lower self-esteem these days than previously, and that lower self-esteem then makes it very hard for you to go through the trials and errors, because just like anything, like learning a sport or learning how to read, you have to do this a lot. It's rinse and repeat.
Yep.
And along the way, you struggle and you figure out. And I used the idea of learning how to read because I don't want to do the same old metaphors of like, it's like going to the gym, or like it's just like learning a new sport. No, like it's so fundamental because everyone needs to learn how to fucking read. In the same way that everyone needs to learn how to have sex.
Yep.
Like, do you think my opinion is too strong? What?
No, well, as you're saying it, I'm imagining a 13-year-old boy at school, and there's some girl in his class who he likes, and he thinks she's pretty, and she's recently developed breasts, and one day he finds himself looking at her breasts and getting a boner, but then he's learned about how the male gaze is bad, and so he's looking at her breasts, he gets a boner, and he thinks, oh, I'm doing a bad thing. So just that simple moment, when you're talking about how the maturational development of a man's sexuality, in that moment, it really fucks up the developmental path. When the 13-year-old thinks he's bad because he looked at a girl's tits and he got turned on, and like it's a fucked up wrench thrown in his gears in an already really difficult developmental mountain that he has to climb.
Wow, I like that, but I would want to see more information about cross-cultural things, about like the difference. I got
a good. It's kind of an interesting cross-cultural clinical example. Okay, so this was an actual case of I think he was 14 when I saw him. I won't say what culture he was from, but he wasn't born in the U.S. and then came to the U.S. And he was on the spectrum. And it was such an interesting case. I got this call from this pediatrician who I've known for a long time, and she occasionally calls me up, and she's like, she only calls me up when she's like wanting to call in a favor. She's like, Dave, please, you got to do me a favor. Can you see this person? And it's always cases that are like complex or difficult. And this one, it was like this kid had been to like many different doctors and psychiatrists and therapists and social workers and blah, blah, blah. And he had all these different things going on because he was spectrum, and then he was starting to show what they thought was like psychotic symptoms because he'd be doing weird things. And then he was like doing weird stalker behavior and got like obsessed and had like delusions about girls. Oh. And then he would start grabbing girls, and he was behaving weird at home. And then he started having tics and started having seizures, and it just got all weird. And I was like, oh, she's like, I've been sending him there and here, and he's been on this med, and he's been on this med, and he's had this assessment and all this shit. And she's like, can you just see him and see what we figure out? I'm like, okay, fuck. And so I bring him in, I bring his parents in, and they have an accent and they have a different appearance. They look different, and the parents could speak English well, but they had a thick accent, and just the cultural thing was strong. And but the kid grew up more here, so he sort of seemed more like an American. And I'm like, they're talking about his delusions and his weird behaviors and his tics, and he was on this med and that med and this med, and after a half hour, I'm like, oh my God, this is complex. I don't know if I'm going to be able to figure this out. And then at some point, at like 35, 40 minutes in, this light went off. I'm like, oh my God, all of this shit is just simply because he's just went through puberty, and suddenly he has raging hormones, and especially his culture, but the school and everything are all just like massively in denial of and terrified of this autistic kid's sexuality.
Holy
and it just like
shit.
hit me like a fucking lightning bolt. And I was like, hey parents, could you guys go wait in the waiting room? And I just started asking him just this really candid thing about being sexually attracted to women, and you could see it just blew his mind. And I brought the parents back in, and I told them what my like diagnosis was is that his sexuality started. It got really like everyone was terrified and incriminated, and it's just like wreaking havoc in them. And you could see the parents, as soon as I said the word sexuality, they just got fucking terrified, and they like didn't say a word. And then eventually the dad was like, okay, well, could you take care of this for us? And I was like, yeah, I can. And so then I just proceeded to have him come in every week, and I'd be like, so, have you been masturbating? And he'd be like, oh my God, Dr. Thompson, you are not supposed to say that.
He would really do that?
And he'd be like, he just was like, and it just blew his mind. And after about 6 weeks of me, and sometimes he would freak out. So he would plug his ears sometimes. Like, oh, he'd be like oh. But eventually, I sort of desensitized it to him, and his tics went away, his delusions went away, his fucked up behaviors went away, everything just went away, like in like 6 weeks.
Holy shit. That is such an awesome case and like addition. That's so much better than just like the stats of, well, this country has this level of repression or this. Man, that's such an amazing case.
Yeah, it was really fun. And the funny part about it is he came in, and I just felt like the dirty old man that just was like corrupting this innocent youth, because it was just kind of like, come in, boy, look at the Playboy magazine. Not that I did that, but it's just like, hey, do you masturbate? What do you think about when you're masturbating? And he just was like, no, don't say those things to me. I'd be like, come on. And eventually got him to do it, and then like it just like fucking magically cured all of his ailments.
Wow. That like, to extend that theory into like, well, this subject matter, which started out to be quite hilarious, then turns out to be like a source of true pathology for young dudes. I see when in the beginning when you were like, oh, it's gonna get fucking dark and weird and we're gonna get serious, I didn't know where you were going with that. Right? Yeah. I thought it was going to turn into a discussion of like, oh, well, where are most of the rapes happening? Well, not in America. Fucking different than what everyone would believe here. They're like, oh, yeah. All the women on college campuses get raped in America. And it's like, no. Like every country in Africa is where the rapes happen. And then it's Sweden for some reason. Like, really? Sweden is unbelievably high in rapes. Twice America.
Wow.
I have no idea what that's about. Like,
yeah.
It just like, that would have been that is a distraction from where we just ended up in this idea of like that's almost like a feminist distraction, that the reason why men's sexuality does need to be repressed further is because if we encourage it, all men are rapists waiting to wake up.
Right.
As opposed to like, shit, if we keep doing this further and further, we're going to end up with some really bizarre psychiatric fallout. Not rapists.
Yeah, totally.
I don't think this is causing rapists. The oppression of male sexuality, I don't think is causing rape. I think it is causing more convoluted psychiatric distress.
Yeah. What I think the thing that I see the most that it's causing is more of a depressed, anxiety, low self-esteem, reclusive misery. That's more what I see it causing.
Oh. Yes. And by the way, that guy does not go out like selecting, secluding a woman and then raping them. Like, that's what rapists do, right? That is a very particularly different person. And the profile of that person is not what everybody thinks it is. Like, it's not some fucking frat bro who is like well off enough to go to a college. Like, yeah, those guys are rapists too sometimes. But no, the profile is actually really specific about like who does this predatory selection and rape thing. But once again, that's not really the subject at hand. I really like this almost like a, to me it's a revelation, because I didn't know where this was going. I was like, just like, oh, I can't wait to talk about the stupidity of like boners and how no one does anything about it. And like, no, like if it's true that big boners are celebrated, then shouldn't we all just go get fucking injections and like massive dongs? Like, but no one I know is doing that. And so it's like really profound where this subject matter ends up. And I just wonder what else will be corrected. Now, I mean, now that you mentioned that case, suddenly it's like there's like a refraction of multitudes of cases. I've talked to so many guys about their sexuality and the process of that, all the way into their mature sexual relationships with their wives, why they have affairs, what are they doing in these in this pursuit of having contact with the sexuality that is expressed, accepted. What do you think? What's the healthy thing?
Well, let's you're kind of opening another chapter. Let's do that next time. Like, what is mature male sexuality and how to get there, and what's the path to a mature male sexuality?
Oh, that would be awesome. I don't really know how to do that, but all right, man.
We'll figure it out.
Okay.
And just, tell the stories of these cases that just came to mind. Tell the stories of it, and through the stories, we'll piece together kind of a sketch of what mature male sexuality looks like.
Okay, dude. That sounds good.
Cool.
All right, man. Okay.
All right, dude.